start. But what I'm going to cover over the next 5 minutes is the three aspects of city centre property. That's retail, office, and residential. Because I sometimes think that when you're talking about city centre property, it's about retail and office. And the one word that drives everything in this, and I'm sure Jordan will probably agree with me on this, is footfall. If people aren't about, then businesses can't operate. And one of the big drivers in city centres in terms of footfall are people in the offices. They come in, they come to work, they buy the services, and they go. It also means that there's a viable level of business available within the city centres, not just at lunchtime, through the evenings. And with our growing amount of residential that we have in some of these big city centres, these residential occupants now depend on that infrastructure being there in the evening. And if you only have to go down to places like Canary Wharf and just see how desperate things are, it's not a great place now, even in the evening, because a lot of the vibrancy has disappeared, because the footfall that would normally have been created by people coming to work, staying around, and even socializing, particularly during the summer, that has gone. And it's making those communities, which people paid a lot of money for, far more difficult. And we'll see how that pans out. But with the lack of people coming into town, it does make it more difficult. And we've heard the well-publicised closures. I mean, Richard mentioned Pret a Manger. We've also seen the places at the railway stations all cutting back, if not shut down completely. And it comes back to one of the issues that was raised in the poll just now around one of the priorities is the financial health of your clients. If all these firms are going bust, eventually it will have an impact on you as the professional advisor. If you've got no clients, you've got no business. So there is, and I understand the government's drive to get people back into the offices and getting people back into the city centres. It does make a big difference. It makes a big impact, and it has an opportunity to keep the economy going. London is probably the worst of all of the major cities around Europe at the moment. Even in North America, we've probably got about 30 to 35% of people back in the office. In places like Shanghai and Frankfurt, what have you, it's over 80%. Now, it could be a factor that we were slower getting into lockdown, but we certainly seem to be a lot slower coming back. And some of the big employers have said they don't see a majority of their people coming back before the new year. It's actually quite worrying, because you just wonder what's going to be left at the end of all of this. There's talk about retail rentals dropping by some 40%, and that's if people can actually rent out properties. There's going to be a lot of closed space at the moment, and there's lots of firms trying to negotiate with landlords to either dump property or just maintain the ones where there is reasonable footfall. And it's quite interesting, when you go out of London, town centres are very busy. There's lots of footfall, there's lots of business being done. In London, I still think the office space in London will bounce back, and I think people are optimistic, looking at what the architects are doing. Developers are always looking at the slightly longer term, and I think what we'll see happening is office space that is currently being redeveloped and looked at in terms of climate change being taken forward, and looking in the wider area of well-being and making sure that they are fit and better places for people to work in. So that's going to have an impact. But the one thing that worries me more than anything is all this residential. And without infrastructure there to support it, it could be very difficult. And this is where we have a lot of people, young professionals working. The people who work for you could find themselves in properties which they can't sell and can't move out of. Because if there isn't a viable base in these city centres where we've got a lot of young professionals working, it can be a real issue. And I think it's something which, senior managers in professional firms and so on should be thinking about, because they need to think about a long-term strategy, not just about what's happening in the immediacy. And with that